Good morning! Unless it's not. Things are out of control. Genres are so weird, I don't know what I'm buying anymore. I thought I was buying bread. At this rate, I could buy anything. I could be looking for an open world shooter and get Jak and Daxter. What's this? Oh god! This is a tragedy! How am I supposed to hate all shooter games when I like Borderlands? Or love all platformers when I hate Balan Wonderworld? Okay, well that one's still easy, but you get the point!
Video games are a wildly new medium compared to those before it. Genres worked pretty well for movies and books because what are you gonna do? Change the font?
My newest novel is a murder mystery comic sans.
It's just convenient to have a label for these kinds of things, especially when making recommendations. You play a lot of platformers? I recommend this one then. Unfortunately, it's not always so simple when it comes to games. Terms like RPG and RTS get thrown around a lot as confusing or broad. I mean, it makes sense. RPG stands for role-playing game, which implies that you're playing a role.
That's every game. In Goose Game, I play the role of an obnoxious waterfowl. Is that an RPG?
Honestly, at this point, it kind of reminds me of things like anime. The technical meaning of that word is basically just cartoons from Japan, pretty much just a translation. But I've seen a lot of people refer to Chinese or Korean cartoons as anime as well. It sort of just became a catch-all term.
RPG is easily one of the most confusing titles that you can give to a video game, so maybe looking at some of the other genres first will help narrow things down, kind of like process of elimination. At the very least, I know Mario isn't an RPG. Crap.
Platformers are some of the earliest games to appear, so it's a staple genre for the medium. They're simple to make, you mostly just have to focus on getting the character to move, so there aren't a lot of stray variables to worry about. That being said, Nintendo has been at the top of the platformer genre for a long time. While a lot of other good platformers have been made, it's hard to argue that Nintendo has the highest amount of quality titles. Main series Mario titles especially tend to be big conversation starters whenever they come around. Mario Bros., Super Mario 64, and even Super Mario Odyssey have been major players in their own rights, and considering that includes titles old and new, Nintendo really has been dominating the market for a while.
So Nintendo game equals platform game, then easy.
Except nothing about Nintendo is ever easy, as evidenced by the lack of a new Rhythm Heaven or Chibi Robo title on the Switch. Platformers are one of the easiest game genres to understand. You just run around and jump. Jumping is pretty much the main requirement to consider a game a platformer. I guess it's not necessarily required, but these games tend to have a heavy reliance on jumping and trying to just make it from place to place. A lot of times, especially more recently, you could probably add the term collectathon as well. I'm not sure if that's a genre on its own. Most games are usually something else as well as a collectathon, but it basically just means what you'd think it means. You collect a lot of stuff.
At least I hope you think, because I usually don't.
One of the most well-known examples of this is Banjo-Kazooie. For something to be labeled a collectathon, they usually have to have multiple things to collect. While most Mario games have coins and some form of star, I don't think they quite fit the bill. If you don't count extra lives or health, Banjo-Kazooie has 7 collectibles. Oh wait, actually 8. I forgot Jinjos.
I do tend to forget about human trafficking. I hope this sentence doesn't incriminate me.
These types of games just have loads of dopamine injections in the form of collectibles being scattered everywhere. They're good, simple fun that I think a lot of people could get behind, and definitely not RPGs probably. Shooters are another really simple genre to define. Basically anything with a gun can be considered a shooter, although that might be too broad of a description. The new Kirby game has a gun.
Kirby shooter when?
It's not too hard to understand what a shooter is. Aim, fire. Although, especially recently, a lot of shooters have started adding traditional RPG elements. Things like special powers, talent points, fantasy stats, all of those have started making their way into games like Borderlands and Destiny. I mean, the newest Borderlands game is set inside their version of Dungeons and Dragons. What's going on here?
I already knew that anything could be an RPG, but what if everything is an RPG? I mean, shooters weren't RPGs, but then Fallout existed. But it's okay, just need to calm down, there are other genres to talk about, there's still plenty left.
Puzzle games are a genre of their own, sure, but a lot of times it's tacked onto other genres of games. For example, I would consider the game Celeste a puzzle platformer. It mostly focuses on platforming, but this particular game is laid out almost like each room is a puzzle you have to find the correct platforming solution to. But that doesn't mean puzzle isn't a genre of its own. Puzzle games to me tend to be arcadey, like Tetris. They don't have to be, but a lot of them have those score-based, continue as long as you can feel to them, like Dr. Mario, Puyo Puyo, but I've definitely seen others. One of the most unique puzzle experiences I've ever seen was The Witness, which is this massive puzzle game where the only thing you do is solve puzzles based on the environment. It was really creative, and I think everybody knows about Portal at this point, so there are still puzzle-exclusive games that don't rely on arcade-style gameplay. But the ones that come to mind most often are those arcadey-style games, which I can never really get into. Although I was curious about the Puyo Puyo Tetris games. See, the games are a mashup of, you guessed it, Puyo Puyo and Tetris. They're both falling block puzzles that involve clearing blocks in their own way, so someone said, why not have them compete? It's weird how well they work together. I mean, they even added these characters with special abilities and stats.
Ah! How are puzzle games also RPGs? That doesn't even make any sense! What about adventure games?
Adventure titles are a bit weird for me to describe as well. The name would suggest that it's any game where you go on an adventure, which is by all means accurate, but also the kind of phrase you could apply to anything. But a lot of adventure titles have a little bit more focus on adventuring. Exploration is a part of it most times, but really you're aiming for a destination. This category very easily falls into sci-fi and high fantasy, since adventures lend themselves well to those environments. But it's not required. In that genre, of course, we have The Legend of Zelda.
Oh, you almost got me there. But there's no way Zelda's an RPG. Let me just check first.
In that genre, of course, we have The Legend of Zelda, which has you adventure all over the place to fulfill the destiny of defeating Ganon or Ganon Substitute. A very well-known franchise, and Miyamoto said when making the first game that he wanted to capture the feeling of adventuring through backyards as a kid. But there may be an even more popular adventure, available on every system known to man, Skyrim.
Damn it!
Yeah, Skyrim has some very heavy RPG influence. The basic archetypes being split into rogue, warrior, mage, and the extremely obvious stat system mean this is just an adventure RPG. It was made by the same people who made shooter RPG with Fallout, so it's not that surprising.
If there are all these different names for genres, how can they all be RPGs? It doesn't make sense!
Horror games can't be RPGs, your character's supposed to be weak in those. Wrong! Dead Space 3 exists, and you can actually get to fight back in that one. What about RTS games? There's so much going on, and there's no way you can add RPG elements. Except one of the most popular RTS games of all time is Warcraft, which is essentially one of the most popular RPG franchises of all time, and a lot of RTS games involve upgrading and customizing units and bases, so wrong again! Aside from that, RTS has a similar issue of having a terrible name, but at least most people agree what games fit into that category, which is to say Command & Conquer and anything that plays exactly like Command & Conquer. But what about sports games? Sports fans and video game fans aren't usually the same people, so there's no way, right? Sports games are completely RPGs! You make a character, min-max his stats, and level up in some of them. What is happening?
So what isn't an RPG? I mean, if everything can turn into one, and the title is even more vague. In I Am Bread, I played the role of a suicidal piece of bread, so that's an RPG, right? I don't know what to do anymore. How am I supposed to differentiate between games if they're all RPGs? Wait a second. I went to college!
I learned two things in video game college, and while one of them was don't go to video game college, the other was MDA, which is a stupid acronym and it makes me mad.
See what I did there?
In my classes, they talked a lot about how genre definitions were terrible and weren't a great way to communicate at all. Now that everything is an RPG, I'm inclined to agree. So MAD breaks games down into their mechanics, how the game plays, aesthetics, what the game looks like, and dynamics, how everything, including the player, interacts. I mean, it makes a lot of sense. What I'm going to be doing in the game matters a lot more than whether it is or isn't an RPG. And for a lot of people, graphics matter a lot. I can't say dynamics is something that regular gamers might talk about, but if you struggle like me,
and I struggle a lot,
then maybe try to reference these when you recommend your next game to a friend. In this case, the mechanics are the most important distinction for an RPG. In most traditional RPGs, or at least in my version of them, you play as a person or persons that combat loads of enemies to gain XP and level up certain stats and abilities. There are a lot of variations on this. For example, Final Fantasy, which has turn-based combat, as opposed to Final Fantasy, which has full-on action combat, and of course Final Fantasy, which has something in between those two.
Gaming is over. Pull the plug.
Final Fantasy is the biggest name in RPG history, most notably remembered for their lack of understanding of the word final. As games grew more complex, traditional turn-based combat in RPGs gave way to more modernly appealing action combat, but a lot of the core concepts still exist. Many of these games have customizable gear and stats, a story that's really engaging, and far too many hours of gameplay. It's a shame my attention span...
So MAD makes me less mad than genres, I guess, but does that automatically make it better?
I may denounce my time in college, but that's mostly hoping that my debt also denounces my time in college. College works fine for a lot of people, and I needed to get that out of the way so I can say, no. MAD is not better. MAD is for professionals trying to pitch a game idea to possible developers. Genres work perfectly fine for what they're trying to do. Human beings aren't robots. We can accept information at face value and then explain what's different. Like, Super Mario RPG is an RPG starring Mario. Did I confuse you?
Well, yes, but for different reasons. Game genres are one of my favorite topics, mostly just because of the insanity of convincing somebody that everything is an RPG. As I said before, it's kind of like anime. You just know it when you see it. Sure, I can tell everybody that every game is an RPG, but I can also lie and say they aren't. As with everything in life, these terms work best as long as they're used in the right context. Humans are imperfect, and our solutions are too. You can't expect one thing to just work well in every situation. I stand corrected.